Well, I'm talking to Professor Dr. Margarita Seselgyta. She is from Lithuania. You're the rector of your university?
Dean of the faculty.
Dean of the faculty of the university in Vilnius.
Yes, I'm the Dean of the Institute of International Relations and Political Science at Vilnius University in Lithuania.
Okay, very good. And your focus is really on strategy, defense matters, and so forth, which is obviously quite important in that part of the world at the moment. So why don't you, I suspect that not everybody listening to this knows exactly where Lithuania is and what its strategic situation. It's a small country, but it's actually quite important given its proximity to Russia, Ukraine, and the conflict that's going on there now. So maybe you can give us a little bit of background as to how you see the geostrategic situation in your part of Europe at the moment.
Yes, thank you for the question. And indeed, we are a very small country. Our population is 2.7 million, so it's like an average city probably in the United States. Some of them are a lot bigger. But we have a very long history living in Europe at the crossroads of the big power competition. Once Lithuania was the biggest country in Europe, but then things have changed and we are a very small country at the moment.
So a lot of parts of what are now Poland were part of the Kingdom of Lithuania.
There was Ukraine, parts of Ukraine, parts of Belarus, even parts of Russia. So we quite know the region, and we have long-term relations with these countries, and in particular with the countries like Ukraine, which were part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and we have a lot of history in common. But why I'm telling this about our history, just to draw the attention that throughout the history we have shrinked, and this difference in size was the result of wars, occupations. We have lost our independence not once. We have restored our independence in the interwar period in 1918. But then we have lost it again, and we have restored it in the 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed. However, we have lived in rather precarious situation all the time. Even after we became members of NATO and European Union, which for us was a major achievement, I would say we had this window, very narrow window of opportunity to jump into the organization when the US was very strong and Russia was very weak, and we were so committed, although everyone was telling to us, no, it's impossible, you are small, you are probably not entirely democratic, you are undefendable, and Russia would get angry. So we managed this, and that changed our security perception. However, Russia has always been near, and it was trying to inflict a damage on our country, trying to influence political system of our country using various instruments of hybrid activities.
Right.
So we have been in this situation for a long time, trying to alert other countries in NATO and the European Union that Russia is not a benevolent partner, but if it's going to get stronger, it might have a revival of imperial ambitions.
Right. So I think that the Baltics have been playing a really important role within NATO because France and Germany are kind of asleep. They don't really recognize that there's an active threat right on their doorstep. And I think you've been pushing NATO, very strongly in the right direction.
Yes, I think that, in general, there was a common belief in the in Europe and probably to a certain extent in the US as well, that the world has changed after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, after the end of Cold War, and now we will be facing, as in words of Bush Senior, Europe whole and free. And there was a lot of optimism. There was a belief that, if we will start partnership with Russia, if we will start trading with Russia, if we increase economic relations with Russia, Russia somehow will become a democratic country. But it didn't happen. And then there were signs, wake-up calls, Munich Security Conference, Russia-Georgian war, the first war in Ukraine. And I think that the Baltic countries and some other countries in the region, like Poland, were reading these signals very seriously, whereas the others were thinking, okay, maybe it's just like temporary, historical sort of a misunderstanding, and if we do not push too hard, maybe Russia will be happy, Putin will be happy, and they will stay in their borders, they won't harm us again. But the problem with Putin and with Russia in general, this regime, but if you look also throughout the history, that Russia does not feel secure, although that's ironic, because it has, the biggest territory in the world, because the borders are fluid and it needs to get more and more territories to get more and more secure. So it's sort of a imperial understanding of the world. And when you try to look from that perspective, you can understand that, Putin and the Russian regime, they will not be happy, they will never be happy with if they are not shown they are wrong from the power position. So they get one territory, they swallow it, and they will go further. So for us, these signals meant that Russia is ready for more and more wars, and ready to move forward into the territories which it considers its legitimate zone of influence. So when I mentioned the quote of Bush about Europe whole and free, after the Cold War, I think that it hasn't materialized. Just the wall landed up with the NATO and the EU border. But there were those countries in between, Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, and Russia was considering this as the zone of their interest and a zone of their influence. And every challenge against their own interest in the zone was considered as a challenge by extension against Russia. The aspirations of those countries to join European Union, NATO, were too challenging for the regime to swallow. So the regime has moved.
Yeah. And what kind of support are you getting from NATO? So things began to change, not enough, but they began to change after the occupation of Crimea in 2014 and the beginning of the war in the Donbass. What's the engagement? What does it look like now? I mean, you are rotating NATO troops through your country, and what are the prospects for, really strengthening the territorial integrity of the Baltics?
I would say there are two directions of what's happening in the region. On one hand, I think that there is an increasing realization in Baltic countries and in Poland that although we are members of NATO, we have to invest in our security on our own. So there was a tremendous increase in the defense spending. If you look at the moment, all those countries are among the biggest spenders in NATO. Poland over 4%, Estonia over 3%, Latvia over 3%, Lithuania just reached 3.2%. So that's one thing. Another thing, that there are a lot of also initiatives on the grassroots level, building the resilience of the country. For instance, in Lithuania, we have voluntary rifleman union organization. So the ranks of this organization have been increasing a lot recently.
And you've had these GoFundMe initiatives where citizens have contributed to buy drones and equipment for Ukraine. And
yes,
that
exactly. So, well, I think that part of our efforts to defend ourselves goes towards the support to Ukraine. So there are state-led initiatives, and again, you have to look at how much those countries, Baltic countries, Poland, Nordic countries, are spending for the aid for Ukraine. Nordic, Baltic 8 countries last year have reached the second place among the biggest spenders for the Ukraine for the aid, military
in
aid.
In proportion to their population.
No, in general. After the first is United States, which is I think 57 billion euros, and then Nordic Baltic countries 16 billion euros
Collectively, yeah.
and then only then goes Germany with 11.
Yeah.
And if you look per capita, it's even more not surprising, but probably encouraging, because it's more than 400 euros per person, whereas the other countries are 100 and less, the leading countries. So it's a huge commitment, and also there is a commitment on the grassroots level, the societal level. Lithuanian people were organizing these, fundraising campaigns. That over weekend they managed to collect at once one time 8 million euros, and I think in a week or something it was the second time 14 million euros. And having in mind a small size of the country, it says a lot about our commitment. So I mean, our own efforts to increase our security and to help Ukraine, and then there come NATO efforts. And I think that we are on a good track since 2007, when we have the first enhanced forward presence battalions, which are landed in 3 Baltic countries and in Poland. But these are it is a very limited force. The battalion is 1,000.
Yeah, well, they're more like tripwire forces.
Exactly. So that the initial idea was that they were tripwire forces, although some countries were very sensitive, of not calling these forces in that way, because it sends a message for their society what these soldiers are there for. But nevertheless, for us it was a first step, and it was important to have presence of the NATO forces in those countries. After the summit in Madrid summit, after the war in Ukraine started, those forces have been increased. Not much, not in every country, but Lithuania had an agreement with the leading framework nation in Lithuania, which is Germany, to expand the battalion into brigade. So that's almost 5,000 troops which will be stationed in Lithuania in 2027. So this is a substantial improvement. And I think that on one hand it is important to have those troops, plus defense plans have been adapted. And I want to go a bit back to the history of defense plans. In 2004, when we entered NATO, we didn't have any defense plans for these 3 countries. So only in 2008, 2009, there were defense plans devised for those countries, but they were built on a scenario of Russians coming in and NATO later on arriving and liberating Lithuania.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what you've seen in Ukraine, in Bucha,
Mm-hmm.
we do not have the strategic depth.
Mm-hmm.
That would have been catastrophic for both
Mhm.
countries.
Mm-hmm.
So now there are different defense plans devised after the Madrid NATO summit, which are based on a commitment to defend every centimeter of NATO's territory from the very beginning. But the challenge is that you have to have a lot of troops and a lot of equipment,
Mhm.
air, land, sea. All the elements have to be in place to ensure this defense and deterrence as well.
Mm-hmm.
So defense plans now are also on the table. So I think that it is also very important. And last but not least, over the years we were trying to convince our partners
Mhm.
in NATO, in European Union, that Russia might be dangerous. And we were looked at as paranoid countries, one-issue countries. And I think that what we have reached recently, that we are finally on the same page, at least on the decision makers level.
Mm-hmm.
So that is very important. There is an
Mhm.
understanding. The caveats are also, I think, about the implementation
Mm-hmm.
of the decisions, defense plans, reinforcements, and here's where I see a problem, because European countries were under-investing in the defense for a long time. So there are major capability gaps, major equipment gaps, and it's very difficult to stand up to their commitments which were made a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and we should probably point out that you've got this particular problem because you actually border on Russia with Kaliningrad. I mean, there's an outpost of Russia that's separated from the main part of the Federation, and that affects you particularly because it's right next to you.
Kaliningrad issue is a very toxic issue for our security, because first of all it's a Russian enclave, and it's been heavily militarized over the years of Soviet Union, and later when the Soviet Union dissolved and it became a part of Russian Federation. So that's one thing, and Russia has been bringing nuclear weapons there. The other challenge is that it lies on the border with Poland, with the Suwalki region of Poland, and Suwalki region is the bordering region with Lithuania. It's a very narrow strip between Kaliningrad, Russia Federation, and Belarus, which is also not a friendly country, as you might know. And Suwalki Gap has been a nightmare scenario for NATO. Political ones called this is the most dangerous place in the world. Why? Having in mind heavy militarization of Kaliningrad, and also having in mind that military of Belarus is not entirely independent, it's basically a part of the Russian Federation. So if Russia wanted to inflict damage on NATO, this narrow strip of 100 kilometers is possible to close down this gap using the military. And what it would mean, you're closing access for the Baltic, for the NATO to access the Baltic countries from the Western Europe.
Yeah, and there was a RAND study a few years ago that went through the scenario of how NATO would then have to reconquer that territory. And logistically, that's very hard because it's hard to get there, it's hard to move equipment. And
exactly. So for us, it's always been one of the major security challenges, but recently a lot has been done since the first war in Ukraine. The NATO reinforcements were also part of these reinforcements were put in that region. There are a lot of exercises going on. There's a very high awareness of what is the problem and what is the potential. But another I would say optimistic development which solves a problem, at least partly, was the Swedish and Finnish membership of in NATO. The Swedish Gotland Island is another way for the NATO reinforcements to come to the country. So it opens another corridor for our defense. So it reduces a bit the challenge of Suwalki corridor. Not entirely, it's still a problem, but it reduces its challenge, and we are able to think of different scenarios how to defend ourselves.
So let me shift the discussion a little bit. Lithuania has been quite remarkable in its participation in the global fight for democracy. And so you upped your relationship with Taiwan. It's got the People's Republic of China very angry, and then they tried to, take it out on the rest of the EU, but you managed to stand up to it. Why is Lithuania so, strong in its defense of these basic democratic values?
I believe the answer lies in our history. I think that freedom is the word which is very important for majority of the Lithuanians, because we know that on one hand, what does it mean to lose it, and that freedom is not for free. That's another thing that we realized over the years. And therefore, we also are very sympathetic towards those countries and those people who are fighting for the freedom. And our foreign policy efforts were concentrating for a long time on Eastern European region. We're trying to help Ukrainian opposition, Belarusian opposition, Georgian opposition. At that time, our politicians were part of the colored revolution, supporting the opposition forces. At the moment, we are hosting probably the biggest part of Russian opposition in exile in Vilnius. Also, the leader of Belarusian opposition, Madam Tsikhanouskaya, is also residing in Vilnius. A lot of Ukrainians came to Vilnius. So I think that this is the spirit of fight for the freedom which lies in our history and in our own fights, and believe that we have to share this. Once we now in a better position, it's our responsibility to help the others. And I think at some point there was a discussion among the decision makers that okay, we are concentrating on one region, so putting all our eggs in one basket. So let's be more global. And probably it has to do a bit with the US pivot to Asia, because US is the major security partner for Lithuania. And although we are members of NATO and the European Union, there's a joke, NATO is is a key for our security, but the US is above all. So, considering the changes in the US foreign policy, its pivot was in the Pacific. I think that was also attempt to align with the interest of one of the major partners. and try to pivot with what we know, with what we understand, by freedom fighting, support for the freedom fighting, to pivot in the Pacific. And the decision to host Taiwanese representation in Vilnius under the name of Taiwan, differently than in other countries, which is under the name of Taipei, also coincided with the broader efforts. We have been establishing embassies in countries like South Korea. We are in Singapore, I guess, as well. We confirmed our new Indo-Pacific strategy, building up the relations with the countries of the region, and Taiwan is one of them, but not only the only one. So this strategy was sort of a pivot, and Taiwan was one of the steps of this pivot. And of course, we have been challenged by China.
But you've managed to survive that.
I believe that China didn't have so much leverage on us because trade relations were not that high. Investment-wise, Lithuania had 10 times more investment in China than Chinese had in Lithuania. And I would say it's related to our very cautious politics towards the foreign investment, which was related to the relations with Russia. We were quite cautious of not letting countries like Russia to invest in our strategic objects. And the law has foreseen very meticulous scrutiny of how to evaluate, potential investors, and China would not fall under the friendly forces image in this law. So we didn't have much investment. So at the beginning, the reaction was the political, the recall of the ambassador, and our ambassador had to leave Beijing. And then, of course, they deleted Lithuanian code from the China Customs Service, so our goods went there, and then they were stopped because there is no country, such country as Lithuania. But fortunately, countries in the region, with which we have developed relations, they were taking those goods, so that the losses were not so high, and then they were offering insurance funds and also advice us how to respond and to keep resilience against China's reaction. The only problem, which would have caused a lot of financial losses, was China's secondary sanctions. China started to blackmail Western companies which cooperate with Lithuania, either our production, where the parts of in their chain of production, or they were having factories in Lithuania. Saying that if they continue cooperation with Lithuania, so they will not let Lithuania their products into China.
These are like German automobiles,
and other companies. So we went to the European Union, and European Union was very helpful for us. So they compiled a complaint to World Trade Organization, but also there were a lot of efforts on the political level in Germany. Their foreign office was involved, but also the U.S. Biden administration was doing quite a lot to help us. So all in all, I think despite huge challenge, having in mind Lithuania's size and China's size, we ended up in a quite good situation where the relationship between Lithuania and the countries of Indo-Pacific are very good, and our cooperation is growing in trade, but also in cybersecurity. other fields of security and defense, efforts how to fight against coercion, economic coercion of China. And I think that this is very important, how we, I would say, broadened our foreign policy horizons.
So maybe we can end up, we're talking only a week before the American election. I don't expect you to make any comments on that, but what's your assessment right now of the situation of Ukraine? Because, I was there a month ago, and, I came away being rather disturbed at the prospects. How do you evaluate how the war has been going?
I really admire how long Ukrainians managed to survive in this terrible war, because it's been draining, and the Russians are not fighting under the humanitarian law, so it's draining civilian population, it's draining infrastructure, and there is a certain fatigue, and there was a strong belief that Ukrainians somehow will achieve some moving forward moment, but it didn't happen, and I think that this is also sending some message of fatigue to the Western countries. So in general, the optimism is very low. It's that neither people in Ukraine nor people in Europe, nor we countries in the region are very optimistic about the outcome. But I think that there are different conclusions that different countries are making. For us, it's essential that Ukraine wins in one way or another, and Russia loses, because we understand what happens if they won't. And again, when we try to explain this to our colleagues from other countries, they say, oh, come on, don't be paranoid, we'll find the solution. But we have the historical experience that if you don't stop the aggressor, it will probably the conflict might be frozen, it will be stopped for a while, but then aggressor will move again. And where it moves, then that's another question. So it used to be this zone of Russian influence, which is on the other part of the Europe whole and free. But I think that this war might inspire Putin to take a step forward and try to challenge NATO, which is he considers as the most evil organization, and in particularly the NATO under U.S. leadership, the most evil thing in the world that has to be conquered. So he might try to test the red lines and see if he can do meddle with some of the NATO countries.
Well, I think that's a good warning that everybody needs to step up. I think there's also a long-term problem with the industrial base in the West, because, we have been donating weapons, but we don't have that many. And nobody has been expecting a long war, but it's now turning into a very protracted conflict. And so I think there are challenges for all of us. So Margarita, I want to thank you. Also, I want to thank Lithuania, because as a small country, you've done, proportionately far more than, your inherent geopolitical weight would suggest you should be able to do. And I think that it is a struggle, a common struggle for all democracies. And so Lithuania has been playing a very honorable part in all of that.
Thank you. I'm a strong believer in democracy. It's still the best form of governance. So I hope that this, now that there is a lot of talk about the decay of democracies, I hope that this is step forward.
Yeah, I do too. Okay, thank you very much.